So hello, everyone. Welcome. It's really good to see you here. Just to give you a taste of what we will talk about today, we will start with an opening by the Institute of Public Policy. Sorry, it's international words. Then we will follow with a keynote speech by the former Minister of Education and Minister for Environment and Sustainability in the Welsh Government, Jane Davidson, on how Wales has responded to global climate issues by radically rethinking public policy for future generations. We will have a roundtable on exploring the implications for youth and Europe, promoting the European Union as a leader in climate action with Kat Suzard, did I say it well? Tully, Managing Director at the School of International Future, Diogo Almeida Alves, Co-founder and CEO at TippingUp, Elaine Façanha, Principal Policy Officer at Associação Zero, and Nevin Elijah, Gulf Natural Gas Distribution Head of European Affairs and founder at Women Energy Portugal. My name is Carolina Pereira. I am the co-founder and CEO at TippingUp. And Paulo, if you would like to start.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your presence and those who are watching this webinar. So IPP with SOIF and TippingUp decided to profit the presence of Jane Davidson in Portugal, the conference that's yesterday in the Foundation. And we thought that was a good occasion to share, invite Jane and share a great experience that she had in Wales. Basically, Wales was the country that made a Future Generation Act, and this is acknowledged as a very important breakthrough in intergenerational sustainability thinking, because this act was made that has major implications on the way Wales deals with all these problems of climate change and recycling, so also education. So it's a broad project, a very interesting project. So we thought that it was very interesting to bring Jane to ISEG and share a bit with people who are at home as well. Thank you very much for coming here, and also and all the participants in this webinar. I just want to make 2 or 3 notes why this is important for IPP. We have a series of books. By the way, I have not read your book, Jane, but I'll do that because who knows? I don't know if you have some translation to Portuguese already, but we have a series of books, IPP with the Portuguese publishers, Medina. And actually, the first book was by Axel Bossari, which is a philosopher, a very important philosopher about intergenerational justice. And our last book of this series, so we have several books, is one of the projects that was presented yesterday in Bem-Estar, which is about governing for the next generations. This was our last book by Catherine Mori and colleagues. So the topic of intergenerational justice is important for IPP, and the topic of climate change, of course, it is as well. So this is the reason why we thought in SOIF that we should profit from the presence here to learn about the Welsh experience and who knows developments that we can make in Portugal, because I can anticipate, since I'm not speaking afterwards, I can anticipate that the future generations that is only once in the Portuguese constitution. And we don't have what we have the High Commission for Future Generations, so we don't have institutions that think about the future. I myself, I was a member of parliament, and when you present the bill in parliament today, you have to present the bill, you have to present the justification and the gender impact of the bill. You have to feel something about the gender impact of the bill, but nothing about future generations, nothing. So we don't have ombudsman, we don't have high commissioner, we don't have any institution that thinks about the future generations. So again, thank you very much for your presence here and all the participants and the club. And this is just to say that both IPP and ISEG, which is where we are in this webinar, very pleased to and very looking forward to.
Thank you. Would you like to follow?
Well,
Do you want to?
thank you so much for that very warm welcome. And thank you to all those of you who are online and here in the amphitheatre for joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted to be in Portugal. I was delighted to be asked to work with the Gulbenkian Foundation in telling the story of Wales. But I do want to be very clear when I tell the story of Wales that I hope there may be things that about in our learning experience that are useful to you and indeed to other countries. But what I'm absolutely not going to do is suggest that Portugal does something like Wales, because all of us come from countries with proud heritage, proud identity, with our own societies, our own economies, our own environment. And what we've tried to do in Wales is create legislation that actually benefits current and future generations in terms of trying to make sure, and this for me is the most fundamental issue, trying to make sure there is a living, breathing planet that I can bequeath as my generation's legacy to my children, to their children, and the children as yet unborn. And what is deeply shocking in a way is, as you said, that we don't know countries that have actually thought about future generations and put it into their constitutions. And so when I found myself as one of the first members of the National Assembly, now a parliament, full parliament, but then a National Assembly, back in 1999, I was absolutely delighted to find that in Wales, in my own country, I had become a national politician in the nation of Wales, in the new National Assembly, and we had a duty to promote sustainable in everything we did. And that was our constitutional duty. And I was so excited by that. I really thought that we were going to be a different kind of institution by having that. And we did try in all sorts of ways to be much more family friendly. We actually, considering that Wales has been at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, the place that provided more coal than anyone else per head of population, and therefore massive fossil fuel contributor, the place where the first £1 million cheque, sterling cheque in the UK was ever signed, selling coal away, but also abstracting the people of Wales's health with it. Wales is the poorest part of the United Kingdom, it has the poorest health. And much of that is that legacy of that same industrial revolution. So where the money went out the door, so did the health, particularly of people in our South Wales valleys. And so Wales has been largely a post-industrial country and an agricultural country. So 2/3 of Wales is actually turned over to agriculture. And when the new National Assembly started with this incredibly exciting duty to promote sustainable development, what I didn't realise, and I didn't realise for 8 years, I've just delivered that duty by talking to you today. All I had to do to promote sustainable development is talk about it. And we know there's a lot of talking about it, but not enough action. And when I had that responsibility as minister, I decided that since the ambition of those who put that into our national constitution was actually that we behave differently, we had to turn a duty to promote into a duty to deliver. And that is what the Wellbeing Future Generations Act is all about. So you've got it here on a slide in front of you. And very simply, everybody probably on this call will know about the commitment of all the UN nations to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And those goals are laid, 17 Sustainable Development Goals are laid out outside the circle. And in the circle are 7 goals where Wales has taken all the Sustainable Development Goals and condensed the core elements of them into 7 goals to deliver more sustainable outcomes for people and planet in Wales. And what's really interesting is that the way in which those goals are expressed is on the face of the Act. So what you see now is the 7 goals, and we'll make sure that this short presentation is available to those who are on the call today. But in essence, what these goals are doing is not doing what governments do normally. Because normally, what governments do is if there's an issue to be resolved, government takes an action. And if that goes wrong, government takes another action, and so on. And so what happens is government takes initiatives and actions downstream, and you might get to a point where you suddenly realise that because this decision was wrong, all those other actions have had to follow. What we're trying to do with this legislation, and this is a bit that I hope might be useful to other countries, is say we've got to stop doing this. We've actually got to think, how do we prevent this happening? How do we look upstream to prevent it happening? So the goals are all about that. You won't see the word growth in the goal about prosperity. You will see that it's about operating within environmental limits. And you will see that it requires that prosperity to be innovative and low carbon, and make sure that it contributes in the context of positive response to climate change. In the second goal, resilience goal, I wish it was called the nature goal, because people don't know what resilience is quite often in this context. But it's about maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. So maintaining biodiversity has not worked. I mean, I've been a minister for so many conferences when we've tested biodiversity and we've tested what's happening. And we now know through work with the WWF and others, we've lost 70% of our biodiversity since 1970. Now, I remember what it was like in 1970, and I grew up in Zimbabwe, so I knew an awful lot about biodiversity there. But of course, if you're much younger, you haven't seen the losses because of how much has been lost over that period of time. But we have to protect that biodiversity because it's the basis on which we all survive. And if you look at all the other goals, I mean, a healthier Wales, we normally measure health and the success of health policies in Wales by, has an ambulance got to a patient on time? Well, that's one of those downstream decisions. How can you prevent many of those people becoming patients is much more important. So if you think preventatively, if you think long term, if you collaborate with each other, if you involve people about whom decisions are being made, if you integrate outcomes, this breaks down government silos and also starts thinking about, well, what are the choices that individuals can make and government can make to keep a population healthy? And that might, for example, which is happening in Wales at the moment, be actually about tackling air quality. Because if you tackle air quality, you're going to improve health in all the major cities by taking out fossil fuels out of the infrastructure. So instead of thinking about ambulance times or how many doctors or nurses, it's what can we do upstream? And the whole of this act is like that. So if we look at equality, what can generate the circumstances in which we are better in the context of recognising inequalities and tackling them, whether they're social, whether they're protected characteristics, or even, crucially at the moment, Wales has defined itself as a nation of sanctuary. And since our chief law officer is Ukrainian, you can guess where there'll be a number of people coming to claim sanctuary. And it's really important to Wales to recognise and support and welcome immigration. And when we then think about, well, what kind of society do we all want to live in? And actually, most people in Wales, if you really get down to the basics about what do they wear and how and what do they want to live in, it's really basic. It's about living somewhere attractive. It's about living somewhere viable, that's working, where you can get transport, where you can buy what you need to buy, where food is grown, where there are services on hand, where you have good internet connections, for example. So it's attractive, it's viable, it's well connected, and it's safe. And what's really interesting, when I was minister back in 2009, and we tested what people in Wales wanted about the very basics for the places they wanted to live in, those were the elements they came up with. And when tested again with a huge consultation, when the UN was consulting on the world we want, Wales consulted on the Wales we want, once again, people were saying, actually, we want our physiological and safety needs met. That's what we want government to do for us. Help us meet those needs. Help us live in really lovely communities in Wales from which our children can be the best that they want to be, etc. So this is all about those upstream choices. And because we have one of the oldest languages in Europe, Welsh, the language of Welsh, iaith Gymraeg, hen iaith o Ewrop, one of the oldest languages in Europe. It's an indigenous language, it's a Celtic language. About a third of people in Wales speak it, it's taught in all our schools. Getting on half our secondary schools teach totally different reading of Welsh. And it's really important in part of our language, heritage and culture. So the Act is very much about not just protecting the language, but protecting issues around art and culture and sport. With government relentless moves towards science, then actually art needs a bit of protection. Creative industries need a bit of protection. And they're the ways in which actually we convince people in changing their lives and behaviour. And finally, a global responsible lens, rather than offshoring our emissions and our negative actions. This last provision, this last goal stops that. A nation, when doing anything to improve the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, takes account of whether doing such a thing may make a positive contribution to global well-being and the capacity to adapt to change, for example, climate change. And if we can just go back to the first slide for a moment, please. Those goals are on the face of the Act. So everybody, all the public organisations, including the government, that are subject to the Act, the government is subject to the Act, I insisted on that, because otherwise governments ask other people to do things they're not prepared to do themselves. So I insisted the government was subject to the Act. So every one of those goals is on the face of the Act, as is those 5 ways of working. So all the public organisations in Wales are required on the front of the law to think long-term, to be preventative, to collaborate with each other, to integrate the outcomes of the goals and to involve people about whom decisions are being made. So what this is doing is reframing, totally reframing the way government policy is now delivered in Wales. Now you probably won't be surprised to hear that in year 1, the government decided not to commence it, because I think it started to realise just what this Act was going to do. So it commenced it a year later. It then allowed organisations 3 years to develop plans, and this government's used to doing this. This is normal stuff. Please develop the plans. And then effectively, it was only last year that this act, the implication of the plans and the act, started, meaning that organisations in Wales were going to government and saying, you're not behaving. You introduced this legislation and you're just not doing well enough. And that has just accelerated. And now we see all sorts of really interesting outcomes. I mean, we have voting at 16 in Wales. We have youth councils in our schools. We have a youth parliament. There are lots of ways in which Wales is continuing now to look at ways of bringing young people more into decision making. There's a set of climate ambassadors as well. And in societal terms, I mean, I'm very excited by this, but those people who leave care, local authority care, people haven't got parents that come from abusive backgrounds, they get put into care. And we are now doing a universal basic income pilot starting this year for care leavers who will be paid a living wage, so that actually we can start seeing whether their outcomes will be improved. Because we know that all the other outcomes we've tried have not worked. Their care leavers' outcomes are the worst of any group of people. And so we're now looking at really radical ways of addressing these issues, but also piloting the use of universal basic income. In terms of, can we go back to the goals, please? In terms of the goals, for example, on that resilient one, the resilient Wales about enhancing biodiversity saw off a motorway that was out to be built. The First Minister of Wales responded to business communities which have been asking for 25 years for this new road and said, no, it's not in the interest of future generations, but is looking at all sorts of other public transport ways in which those needs the business community expresses can be met rather than by individual transportation. And for example, now in our cities, it's not the transport official who's leading what happens about taking cars out of cities or changing arrangements, it's a health official. So actually that issue around air quality will be far more effective, both in terms of driving the new transport agenda, but improving people's quality of lives by being preventative about problems happening in the first place. Now I'm just giving you some examples. I hope that in discussion we may want to pick up more, but just showing you already that the Act is having an effect when it's only really been 2 years into its implementation. And one of the most exciting ones, and I think this has hopefully some read across to a lot of other countries in the world, is actually where communities that have been left behind by whatever it is, in our case, the Industrial Revolution, and therefore these miners' houses were built to extract coal from the local environment. And then when the coal was extracted, the homes were still there. They were sold to them by the coal board for a nominal amount. Those homes are among the poorest housing in the whole of Europe. And they are owner occupied. And therefore those owners do not have the money to tackle the key issues that they have. And how now are we going to be able to look and work with those communities? Government always tries to find ways to send money to those communities, to generate new economic opportunities, but they're a very long way from it. And it's really hard if you're a very long way. So under this Act, 3 of those communities in 3 different valleys have taken control for themselves. And they are working with their local and with their national government to see if there are new ways of developing that land in ways that meet the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now that is incredibly exciting and potentially could be something of interest to other countries also looking at how local communities can be the agents of their own change. Next slide, please. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this. I just thought it was worth putting up because Portugal and Wales. In fact, Portugal's here. It's just dropped off the slide. So, country overshoot days are that notion where is the thank you, there you are. The world's ecological footprint. How many planets, as just a quick guide, and it's great, particularly with young children, in terms of talking through about, how many planets have we got? One. How many planets are we using in our daily lives? And of course, all the countries over here are using 4 planets or more if we operate from May upwards. The reason it's May is the country overshoot day is the date into 2021 at which each of the countries named on this chart overshot its ability to regenerate its natural resources. Overshot. Now, ideally, you'd start in January and there'd be no overshooting at the end of December. Because you'd want there still to be replenishment within the earth. But in fact, and the first book on this, Limits to Growth, Professor Danella Meadows achieved, was in 1972. And she thought governments would listen to the evidence. And here we are in 2022, 50 years later, and governments are still not listening to that, even though all these countries, including the United Kingdom, including Portugal, are overshooting by May. Now, during COVID, it went back, and we overshot, in fact, a month later. But we don't know what it's going to be in 2022 yet, and we certainly don't know what it might be post the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2023, if we end up with hugely accelerated fossil fuel extraction. But we do only have one planet. And of course, we are the problem, and all those countries over there are experiencing climate issues that we are causing. So this is a massive social justice agenda. Next slide, please. But what is a really, I hope, positive story is, Wales is tiny. 3 million people, 10 million sheep. It is not a member state of the UN or anywhere else. It is a regional government, a sub-national government. And yet, when I introduced a plastic bag charge, just about 2010, within 4 years, the rest of the UK followed. When I introduced draconian recycling targets punishable by large fines for not achieving in 2009, now Wales is competing with Germany and Singapore this year to be best in the world. And Wales, with its ambition about the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, there are other countries. Scotland's putting legislation through this year. Ireland is starting legislation this year. New Zealand has introduced a wellbeing budget. Iceland is really interested in what is happening in this story. 2 provinces in Canada are interested, 2 states in Australia are interested. So we're starting to see, and there are sub-national places in Europe which are already which are interested as well. There is starting to be an appetite for how do we deliver on climate without using the word climate. And I'm sorry that it has to be that way, in a way, because I spent a long time being one of those ministers who was always going to talk about climate as the climate minister. But I have noticed in the 20 years in which I've been doing this, that either people look at me when I talk about climate, or they look away. And if they look away, they've turned off to that message. But people don't turn off to a message about their loved ones. So I just want to finish with the idea that if everybody here, either in this room or on this call, thinks about the person that they love most, the oldest person that they love most, and the youngest person that they love most, and think about the fact that there could potentially be 200 years between the lives of that oldest person and that youngest person. And that's in your family or in your friendship group or whatever. But actually, we don't have anything like that long. And if we can start looking at that intergenerational relationship, the well-being of future generations, straight back to the Brundtland definition that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That, for me, is the way that we frame this agenda, and we always remember that. We are not above nature, we are a part of nature, and nature is essential to our survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. If I actually wrote that sentence of sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's exactly the core of everything we are trying to do. I would like to follow by